The whistle screamed across the dusty platform of Rock Springs, Wyoming, and Rebecca Gardner stood frozen as the locomotive lurched forward, leaving her behind while her future disappeared into the distance. She had meant to board that train, meant to continue east to San Francisco where a teaching position waited. But something in her gut had twisted hard when she climbed those iron steps, and she had stumbled backward onto the platform just as the conductor shouted his final warning. It was August of 1882, and the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the rail station, turning the wooden planks beneath her boots into something that felt like it might catch fire at any moment. Rebecca stood there in her traveling dress of deep blue cotton, watching the train become a speck on the horizon, and felt the full weight of what she had just done settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. Her trunk sat abandoned 20 feet away where a porter had left it, and she realized with a sick feeling that she had no money for lodging, no plan, and absolutely no idea what had possessed her to jump off that train. The platform emptied quickly. A few ranch hands collected their supplies. A family reunited with tears and embraces, and within minutes Rebecca found herself utterly alone except for one man who stood near the station house, a hat pulled low over his eyes. He was tall, built like someone who spent his days working land that did not give up its bounty easily, and he watched her with an expression she could not quite read. She turned away, pressing a hand to her forehead, trying to think through the panic that threatened to overwhelm her completely. "Miss, you planning on staying or did you miss your train?" The voice came from behind her, rough but not unkind. Rebecca turned to find the man approaching, and she got her first proper look at him. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of weathered leather. His face was sun-darkened and angular, marked by someone who did not smile easily but was not cruel either. He wore work clothes, a vest over a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and there was dust on his boots that spoke of a long ride into town. "I did not miss it," she heard herself say, and her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "I chose not to board." The man studied her for a long moment, his gaze flicking to her trunk and then back to her face. "Rock Springs is not much of a town to choose if you do not mind my saying so. You got people here." No, the admission felt dangerous, but lying seemed pointless. "I had a position waiting in San Francisco, but I just could not bring myself to get on that train." She did not know why she was telling this to a complete stranger, except that standing alone on that platform had made her feel more isolated than she had ever felt in her 22 years of life. The man shifted his weight, and she noticed he carried himself with a certain carefulness, like someone who had learned young that the world could turn on you if you were not paying attention. "Name is Bennett Stone," he said after a pause. "I run a ranch about 8 miles northwest of here. Not much to look at, but it is mine free and clear. Rebecca Gardner." She hesitated, then added, "I appreciate the introduction, Mr. Stone, but I should figure out what I am going to do next." Bennett glanced at the sun, which had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon. "Station master already locked up and headed home. Only hotel in town is the Rockwell, but I would not recommend a lady staying there alone. It caters mostly to railroad workers and miners passing through." Rebecca felt her chest tighten. She had not thought beyond the moment of stepping off that train, had not considered the practicalities of what came next. She had saved enough money for her journey to San Francisco, and perhaps 2 weeks of expenses once she arrived, but Rock Springs had not figured into her calculations at all. "I see." She tried to keep her voice level. "Then I suppose I will need to sort something out quickly." Bennett looked at her trunk again, sitting there in the dust with her name painted on the side in neat black letters, and something in his expression shifted. "Listen, Miss Gardner, I do not make a habit of inviting strangers to my property, but you look like you could use a place to figure things out. My ranch has a spare room. My housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, lives in town, but she comes out 3 times a week. You would be safe there, and it would give you time to decide what you want to do next." Rebecca stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You are offering me a room at your ranch. Mr. Stone, we have only just met. I am aware of that." A hint of something that might have been humor touched his eyes. "But the way I see it, you have 2 choices. You can try your luck at the Rockwell and probably end up in a situation you do not want, or you can accept help from someone who is offering it without strings attached. Your trunk is sitting there getting dusty, and the sun will be down in a few hours." It was the most impractical, potentially dangerous thing she could possibly do, and yet Rebecca found herself considering it seriously. There was something in Bennett Stone's manner that felt genuine, and she had always prided herself on being a good judge of character. More than that, she felt bone tired from the journey and the emotional upheaval of the past hour, and the thought of fighting her way through a questionable hotel alone made her want to sit down on her trunk and refuse to move. "Why would you do this?" she asked quietly. "You do not know anything about me." Bennett picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing, settling it against his hip. "My mother used to say that we help people when we can because someday we might need helping ourselves. She died when I was 16, but I figure her advice is still good." He nodded toward a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses at the end of the platform. "That is my rig. If you are coming, we should get moving." Rebecca stood there for one more heartbeat, weighing every sensible objection she could think of against the simple fact that she had nowhere else to go. Then she picked up her carpetbag, lifted her chin, and followed Bennett Stone toward his wagon. He secured her trunk in the back with practiced efficiency, then offered his hand to help her up onto the bench seat. His palm was calloused and warm, and he released her hand the moment she was settled, keeping everything proper and distant. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue at the horses. They moved forward smoothly, and Rock Springs began to fall away behind them. The landscape opened up as they left town, all sage brush and distant red rock formations that glowed in the late afternoon light. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and something green that Rebecca could not quite identify. She gripped the edge of the bench as the wagon jolted over the rough road and tried to calm the frantic beating of her heart. "You mind if I ask why you jumped off that train?" Bennett's voice broke the silence between them. Rebecca considered how to answer. "I was engaged to be married," she said finally, "to a man named Thomas Whitmore in Boston. He was respectable, educated, everything my parents wanted for me. But he also had a temper, and he believed a wife should be seen and not heard. When I broke off the engagement 6 months ago, my family was mortified. The teaching position in San Francisco felt like an escape, but when I got on that train today, all I could think was that I was still running away instead of choosing something for myself." Bennett absorbed this information without comment for a long moment. "So what do you want to choose?" "I do not know yet." The admission felt both terrifying and liberating. "That is the truth of it. I just knew I could not get on that train." "Fair enough." Bennett guided the horses around a particularly deep rut in the road. Running away and starting over are not always the same thing. Sometimes you have to stop moving to figure out which one you are doing. There was a weight to his words that suggested personal experience, but Rebecca did not pry. They rode in silence for a while, and she found herself studying the landscape with growing interest. Wyoming was nothing like Massachusetts, where she had grown up in a tidy townhouse with manicured gardens and strict social rules. This land felt raw and unforgiving, but there was a beauty to it that caught at something deep in her chest. "How long have you had your ranch?" she asked. "5 years as of last month. I worked as a ranch hand for a man named Garrett Sullivan for 7 years before that, saved every penny I could. When he decided to sell off a parcel of his land and retire, I bought it from him. 300 acres, a house that needed work, and a creek that runs year-round." There was pride in his voice, carefully controlled but unmistakable. "Built up a decent herd of cattle, grow hay for winter feed, and I break horses on the side for extra money." "That sounds like a lot of work for one man." "It is," Bennett shrugged. "I hire help during roundup and branding season, otherwise I manage well enough on my own." Rebecca tried to imagine what that life must be like, the solitude and the constant physical labor, and found she could not quite picture it. Her own life had been full of social obligations and drawing rooms, music lessons and carefully orchestrated introductions to eligible young men. The idea of owning land and working it with your own hands felt almost exotic. The sun hung low on the horizon when Bennett pointed ahead to where a cluster of buildings came into view. "That is the ranch," he said simply. Rebecca leaned forward, shading her eyes against the glare. The main house was a single-story structure made of weathered wood, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and one side. Behind it stood a barn, a smaller outbuilding she guessed might be a stable, and several corrals where horses moved lazily in the evening heat. It was not grand, but it looked solid and well-maintained, the kind of place built to withstand whatever weather and time might throw at it. Bennett pulled the wagon up to the front of the house and set the brake. He jumped down and came around to help Rebecca descend, and she found her legs slightly unsteady after the long ride. He retrieved her trunk and carried it up onto the porch, setting it down near the door before pulling out a key to unlock it. "Welcome home," he said as he pushed the door open, and there was something in the way he said it that made Rebecca's throat tighten unexpectedly. The interior of the house was simpler than she expected, but not primitive. The front door opened into a main room that served as both kitchen and living space, with a cast-iron stove against one wall and a table with 4 chairs near the window. A worn but clean sofa sat facing a stone fireplace, and there were bookshelves along one wall that were actually full of books. Everything was tidy, and the floors looked recently swept. "Mrs. Chen was here yesterday," Bennett explained, noticing her surprise at the cleanliness. "She makes sure I do not live like a complete animal. Your room is through here." He led her down a short hallway to a small bedroom that contained a narrow bed with a quilt folded at the foot, a dresser with a mirror, and a washstand with a pitcher and basin. A window looked out toward the mountains in the distance, and the evening light slanted through it in golden bars. Bennett set her trunk at the foot of the bed. "I am across the hall if you need anything during the night, but I will respect your privacy. Privy is out back about 30 feet, and there is a pump by the kitchen for water. I will get a fire going and make something for dinner." Rebecca turned to face him, suddenly overwhelmed by the strangeness of the entire situation. "Mr. Stone, I do not know how to thank you. This is incredibly generous, and I promise I will figure out a plan as quickly as possible so I am not imposing on your hospitality." "You are not imposing." Bennett leaned against the doorframe, his expression serious. "Take whatever time you need. Now I am going to see about those horses and then get some food together. Make yourself comfortable." He disappeared down the hallway, and Rebecca sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline of the day finally began to drain away. She had taken a remarkable gamble, and part of her wondered if she had lost her mind entirely. But another part of her, the part that had refused to board that train, felt a curious sense of rightness about being here in this small, clean room with the Wyoming evening settling in outside her window. She unpacked a few essentials from her trunk, splashed water on her face from the basin, and smoothed her hair back into some semblance of order. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Bennett at the stove, stirring something in a large pot that smelled surprisingly good. "I hope you like stew," he said without turning around. "It is not fancy, but it is filling. It smells wonderful." Rebecca hesitated, then moved to the table. "Can I help with anything? You can slice that bread if you want. Knife is in the drawer there." They worked in companionable silence, and Rebecca found there was something soothing about the simple domestic tasks. When the food was ready, Bennett ladled generous portions into bowls and they sat across from each other at the table. The stew was beef and vegetables with plenty of black pepper, and Rebecca discovered she was ravenous. "This is very good," she said after a few bites. "Did Mrs. Chen teach you to cook?" "My mother, actually." Bennett broke off a piece of bread. "My father died in a mining accident when I was 12, and after that it was just the two of us. She made sure I knew how to take care of myself before she passed. Said she was not raising a man who could not feed himself or keep a house. She sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was." Bennett's expression softened slightly. "Stubborn as hell and twice as tough, but she had a good heart. I think about her a lot, especially when I am making decisions about the ranch. She always wanted me to have land of my own." Rebecca studied him across the table, noting the way he held himself with that particular combination of strength and restraint that seemed to define him. "You must miss her. Every day." He met her eyes. "But missing someone and letting it stop you from living are two different things." "She would have kicked my backside if I spent my life mourning instead of building something." They finished their meal as the last of the daylight faded outside, and Bennett lit a kerosene lamp that cast warm shadows across the room. Rebecca helped him clean the dishes, and they fell into an easy rhythm of washing and drying that felt oddly natural. When everything was put away, Bennett stoked the fire in the stove and straightened up, rolling his shoulders like someone who had been working since before dawn. "I am usually up with the sun," he said. "You are welcome to sleep as late as you need. There is coffee and food in the kitchen, and you should make yourself at home." "Thank you." Rebecca folded the dish towel carefully, suddenly aware of how strange and intimate it was to be alone with this man in his house, even though nothing improper had occurred. "I appreciate everything you have done today, Mr. Stone. I know it cannot be comfortable having a stranger in your home." "Call me Bennett," he said. "And honestly, it is not as strange as I thought it might be. You are easy company, Miss Gardner." "Rebecca," she offered, "if we are being informal." He smiled then, a brief expression that transformed his serious face into something warmer and more approachable. "Rebecca, it is. Get some rest. Tomorrow will come early whether we are ready for it or not." She retreated to her small bedroom and changed into her nightgown, grateful for the privacy and the soft bed after days of travel. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her, Rebecca wondered what on earth she was going to do next. She had enough money to buy a train ticket back east or onward to California, but neither option held any appeal. The teaching position would have been filled by someone else by now, and returning to Boston meant facing her family's disappointment and Thomas's inevitable smugness at her failure to make a new life. But staying here was not an option either. Bennett had been kind, but he had his own life and could not possibly want a stranger taking up residence indefinitely. She would need to make a decision soon, and the thought made her chest tight with an anxiety she could not quite name. Rebecca woke to the sound of someone moving around in the main room, and gray morning light filtered through her window. She dressed quickly in a simple calico dress, pinned her hair up, and ventured out to find Bennett at the stove making coffee. He looked like he had been awake for hours, and there was already a sheen of sweat on his forehead that suggested he had been working. "Morning," he said, glancing up. "Coffee will be ready in a minute. I have some eggs and bacon if you are hungry." "Let me cook," Rebecca offered. "You have been working already, and I should earn my keep somehow." Bennett looked like he might argue, but then he nodded and stepped aside. "Eggs are in that basket. Bacon is in the cold box out on the porch. I will take my coffee outside and check on a few things while you work." He poured himself a cup of the strong black coffee and disappeared out the front door, giving her space to navigate the kitchen on her own. Rebecca found everything where he said it would be, and set about making breakfast with more confidence than she felt. She was a competent cook, though her skills ran more to afternoon tea and light suppers than ranch cooking, but she managed to produce a respectable meal of scrambled eggs, bacon, and toasted bread. Bennett returned just as she was setting the table, and he raised his eyebrows appreciatively. "That looks good. You did not have to go to all this trouble." "It is hardly trouble. Besides, you fed me last night. It is only fair." They ate together as the sun climbed higher, and Rebecca found herself relaxing into the routine of it. Bennett asked about her journey west, and she told him about the long train ride from Massachusetts, the strange towns she had passed through, and the growing sense of panic that had built with every mile that took her farther from everything familiar. "What made you agree to marry Thomas in the first place?" Bennett asked, pushing his empty plate aside. "If you do not mind me asking." Rebecca considered the question carefully. "I thought it was what I was supposed to do. He was suitable, my parents approved, and I convinced myself that love would grow over time. But the more time I spent with him, the more I realized he did not want a partner. He wanted someone decorative who would never question him or have opinions of her own. When I tried to express my thoughts on suffrage or education reform, he would pat my hand and tell me not to worry my pretty head about such things." "Sounds like an ass," Bennett said bluntly, and Rebecca laughed despite herself. He was. But breaking the engagement felt like failing somehow, like I was proving everyone right who said women were too emotional and changeable to make important decisions. Or maybe it means you were smart enough to recognize a mistake before you were locked into it permanently. Bennett stood and carried his plate to the sink. "That takes courage, not weakness." His words settled over her like a balm, and Rebecca felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. They cleaned up together, and then Bennett announced he had work to do in the barn, but she was welcome to explore the ranch if she wanted. Rebecca spent the morning wandering the property, taking in the corrals where several horses watched her with curious eyes, the vegetable garden behind the house that was producing impressive amounts of squash and beans, and the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property. The water was clear and cold when she dipped her fingers in it, and she sat on the bank for a while, listening to the sound of it moving over stones and trying to quiet her racing thoughts. The next few days fell into a pattern that was both strange and comfortable. Rebecca cooked breakfast while Bennett handled the morning chores, and then he would disappear to work on various ranch projects while she occupied herself with cleaning the house, mending clothes she found that needed repair, and reading from his surprisingly extensive library. In the evenings, they would cook dinner together, and afterward they would sit on the porch as the sun set, talking about everything and nothing. Rebecca learned that Bennett had grown up in Nebraska, that he had headed west at 18 after his mother died, because staying in the place where she had lived felt impossible. He had worked a dozen different jobs before landing with Garrett Sullivan, and he spoke about the older rancher with obvious affection and respect. He read voraciously, everything from practical manuals on animal husbandry to novels by Charles Dickens, and he admitted with some embarrassment that he had a weakness for poetry, even though he knew it was not particularly manly. "Poetry is not unmanly," Rebecca protested. Lord Byron certainly never seemed to think so, and he was notorious for his romances. Fair point. Bennett stretched his legs out in front of him, his boots dusty from the day's work. "What about you? What do you like to read?" "Everything. Novels, history, philosophy when I can get my hands on it. My father used to say I read too much for a woman, that it would make me unmarriageable. Clearly your father and Thomas would have gotten along well." Rebecca laughed, a real laugh that felt like it came from somewhere deep inside her. "Probably. Though my father was not a bad man, just very traditional. He genuinely believed he was protecting me by trying to marry me off to someone respectable." "Sometimes protection and control look an awful lot alike," Bennett observed quietly. She glanced at him, struck by the insight in his words, and found him watching her with those steady brown eyes that seemed to see more than she was comfortable with. The air between them felt suddenly charged, and Rebecca looked away, her heart beating faster than it should. Mrs. Chen arrived on the 4th day of Rebecca's stay. A small woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a no-nonsense manner that was immediately reassuring. She took in Rebecca's presence with one shrewd look, glanced at Bennett, and then proceeded to act as if having a young woman in residence was perfectly normal. "You will help me with the laundry," she announced to Rebecca, not asking but stating a fact. "Bennett, you have mending that needs doing." "Where is it?" They fell into work under Mrs. Chen's efficient direction, and Rebecca found herself grateful for the older woman's presence. It made everything feel more proper, and less like she was living in some kind of strange isolation with a man she barely knew. Mrs. Chen asked pointed questions about Rebecca's background and plans, and seemed satisfied with the honest answers she received. "You are running from something or running toward something?" Mrs. Chen asked as they hung sheets on the line behind the house. "I am not sure anymore," Rebecca admitted. "Maybe both, maybe neither. Bennett is a good man. Lonely but good. Do not hurt him if you can help it." The words were delivered without accusation, but Rebecca felt their weight nonetheless. "I would never intentionally hurt anyone. But I do not know what I am doing here or how long I can stay." "Then figure it out." Mrs. Chen pinned a sheet with practiced efficiency. "Life does not wait for you to be ready." That evening, after Mrs. Chen had returned to town and dinner was finished, Rebecca brought up the subject she had been avoiding. She found Bennett in the barn, checking on a mare who was close to foaling, and she leaned against the stall door while he ran his hands over the horse's swollen belly. "Bennett, I need to talk to you about my situation." He looked up, his expression guarded. "All right. I have been here almost a week, and I cannot impose on your hospitality indefinitely. I have some money saved, and I could pay you for room and board, but I need to figure out a more permanent solution." Bennett straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his pants. "What kind of solution are you looking for?" "I do not know. That is the problem." Rebecca wrapped her arms around herself. "I do not want to go back east, and the teaching position in San Francisco is no longer available. I have skills, but I do not know what use they are in a place like Rock Springs." "What kind of skills?" "I can read and write in English, French, and passable German. I am good with numbers. I can teach, though I do not know if there is a school here that would hire me. I can sew and cook and run a household, but those are not exactly marketable." Bennett leaned against the stall, his arms crossed over his chest, and Rebecca had the sense he was thinking through something carefully. Rock Springs does have a school, but I think they already have a teacher. However, there are a lot of families in the area who might want someone to tutor their children, especially in languages or more advanced subjects. You could set yourself up as a private teacher, maybe work out of the church hall in town. That is actually a good idea. Rebecca felt a spark of hope. Do you think there would be interest? I think you would be surprised. Wyoming might be rough country, but there are plenty of people here who want their children to have opportunities they did not. If you can teach French and German, the merchant families especially might be interested. Those connections could be valuable for business. They talked for another hour about the practicalities, and by the time Rebecca returned to the house, she felt like she had the beginning of a plan. Bennett offered to introduce her to people in town, and they agreed she would stay at the ranch for at least another month while she established herself. She insisted on paying him, and after some argument, he accepted a small amount for room and board that was far less than she knew she should be paying. Rebecca lay in bed that night feeling lighter than she had in months. She had a direction now, something concrete she could work toward, and the prospect of building something of her own filled her with excitement that was almost frightening in its intensity. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. Bennett took her into Rock Springs and introduced her to the minister at the Presbyterian church, who agreed to let her use a small classroom in the church building for teaching. Word spread quickly through the town about the educated Eastern woman offering tutoring, and within a week, Rebecca had 5 students signed up for lessons. Within 2 weeks, she had 10. She taught basic literacy to younger children in the mornings and offered French, German, and advanced mathematics to older students in the afternoons. The work was satisfying in a way her engagement to Thomas never had been, and she fell into bed each night exhausted but content. Bennett continued to insist she stay at the ranch, and the pattern of their days together became something Rebecca looked forward to more than she wanted to examine too closely. He would drive her into town 3 days a week for her lessons, and on the other days she would help around the ranch, learning how to gather eggs from the chickens Bennett kept, how to tend the vegetable garden, even how to handle the horses with the gentle confidence he demonstrated. He was a patient teacher, never making her feel foolish for her ignorance, and Rebecca found herself soaking up the knowledge like someone dying of thirst. One evening in late September, they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, and Rebecca realized with a start that she had been at the ranch for almost 2 months. It felt both longer and shorter than that, as if time had taken on a different quality here. Bennett had been talking about his plans for the winter, how he would need to move the cattle to lower pastures and make sure he had enough hay stored to get through the cold months. "You get a lot of snow here?" Rebecca asked. "Enough. Last winter we had a blizzard in January that lasted 3 days. Lost a few head of cattle, but most of them made it through." He glanced at her. "Winter here is not easy, especially if you are not used to it." There was something in his tone that made Rebecca turn to look at him fully. "What are you saying?" Bennett was quiet for a long moment, his profile sharp against the twilight. "I am saying that if you are planning to stay in Rock Springs, you need to think about where you will be when the weather turns. The church does not have heat in that classroom, and traveling back and forth to town will be difficult once the snow comes." "I have been thinking about that," Rebecca admitted. "I have saved most of what I have earned from teaching, and I thought perhaps I could rent a room in town. Mrs. Chen mentioned that the widow Henderson sometimes takes in boarders. You could do that." Bennett's voice was carefully neutral. "Or you could stay here through the winter." Rebecca's breath caught. "Bennett, I have already imposed on you for so long. It is not an imposition." He turned to face her, and in the dim light his eyes were very dark. The truth is, Rebecca, I have gotten used to having you here. The house feels different with you in it, and I do not particularly want to go back to eating dinner alone every night. I know it is not entirely proper, even with Mrs. Chen coming by regularly, but I trust you and I think you trust me. If you want to stay, I would like you to. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. What exactly are you proposing? I am proposing that we are friends and friends help each other out. You can keep teaching and saving money, and when spring comes, if you want to find your own place in town, I will help you do that. But for the winter, stay here where it is warm and safe and you do not have to worry about frozen pipes or getting snowed in alone. It made practical sense, and yet Rebecca knew there was more to it than practicality. Over the past 2 months, something had been growing between them, something neither of them had acknowledged directly, but that colored every interaction they had. She enjoyed his company more than she had enjoyed anyone's company in her life. She liked the way he listened when she talked, really listened, as if her opinions mattered. She liked his quiet competence and the way he moved through the world with such groundedness. She liked the rare smiles he gave her that felt like gifts, more than liked if she was being honest with herself. "All right," she said softly. "I will stay for the winter, but only if you let me contribute more. I can take on more of the cooking and household work, help with the animals. I do not want to be a burden." "You could never be a burden." The words were simple, but the way he said them made Rebecca's throat tighten. "But if it makes you feel better, I will put you to work." They smiled at each other in the darkness, and Rebecca felt something shift between them, some invisible line being crossed. She knew she should be more cautious, should protect her heart better, but sitting there on the porch with Bennett Stone, she found she did not want to be cautious. She wanted to stay exactly where she was. October arrived with crisp mornings and afternoons that still held summer's warmth. Rebecca's tutoring business continued to grow, and she found herself teaching nearly 20 students across various subjects. The money she earned was modest but steady, and for the first time in her life, she felt the satisfaction of supporting herself through her own efforts. Bennett had been true to his word about putting her to work, and Rebecca threw herself into learning everything she could about ranch life. She learned how to milk the cow Bennett kept for fresh dairy, how to churn butter, how to preserve vegetables for the winter months. He taught her to ride properly, starting her on a gentle mare named Daisy, and she progressed from nervous clutching to actual confidence in the saddle. One afternoon in mid-October, they rode out together to check on the cattle grazing in the far pasture. The air was cool and clear, and the landscape had taken on the golden tones of autumn. Rebecca had grown comfortable on horseback, and she rode beside Bennett feeling more alive than she could remember feeling in years. "You have gotten good at this," Bennett commented, nodding toward the easy way she sat her saddle. "I had a good teacher." Rebecca patted Daisy's neck. "A few months ago, I never would have imagined I would be riding across open country like this. Life is strange that way. You never know what version of yourself you will discover if you let yourself try new things." They reached the pasture and dismounted to walk among the cattle, and Bennett pointed out various animals and explained his breeding program. Rebecca listened, fascinated by the complexity of it all, the careful decisions about which bulls to use and which cows produce the healthiest calves. His passion for the work was evident, and she found herself watching him as much as she watched the cattle. He had become so familiar to her over the past months. She knew the way he pushed his hair back when he was thinking hard about something. She knew he was terrible at mending his own clothes, but could fix almost any piece of broken equipment on the ranch. She knew he drank his coffee black and liked his eggs over easy, that he read by lamplight every night before bed, that he sometimes hummed tunelessly while he worked. She knew all these small things, and each one felt precious. "Rebecca." Bennett's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "You are staring." She felt heat rush to her cheeks. "I was just thinking." "About what?" "About how different my life is now compared to what I thought it would be." Bennett studied her face, his expression serious. "Do you regret jumping off that train?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "Not even a little bit." Something flickered in his eyes, but before he could respond, one of the cows let out a distressed bellow. Bennett's attention snapped away immediately, and he strode toward the animal with Rebecca close behind. The cow was lying on her side, and even Rebecca could see something was wrong. "She is in labor," Bennett said, dropping to his knees beside the cow. "But the calf is not positioned right." Rebecca watched as he examined the cow with gentle, efficient hands, and then he was rolling up his sleeves and reaching to help reposition the calf. It was messy, difficult work, and Rebecca found herself holding the cow's head, murmuring soothing nonsense while Bennett worked. After what felt like an eternity, the calf slid free, and Bennett cleared its nose and mouth quickly. The calf took a shuddering breath, and then another, and the mother cow struggled to her feet to begin cleaning her baby. Bennett sat back on his heels, covered in blood and birthing fluid, and the expression on his face was one of profound satisfaction. "That was close. If we had not been here, I do not think either of them would have made it. You saved them." Rebecca was awed by what she had just witnessed. "We saved them," Bennett corrected. "You kept her calm." They rode back to the ranch in companionable silence, and Rebecca could not stop thinking about the moment when the calf had taken its first breath, the fierce joy on Bennett's face. This was what he loved, this work of tending and protecting and helping things grow. It was beautiful and hard and real in a way that her old life in Boston had never been. That evening, after they had both cleaned up and eaten dinner, Bennett suggested they sit outside even though the air had turned cold. He built a small fire in a ring of stones near the porch, and they pulled chairs close to it, warming their hands against the flames. "Thank you for your help today," Bennett said. "Not everyone would be comfortable with something like that." "It was incredible to watch," Rebecca replied honestly. "You knew exactly what to do. Years of practice." "Garrett taught me most of what I know about livestock, but some of it you just learn by doing." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you miss your old life? The parties and the society and all of that?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "I miss my mother sometimes, even though we did not always see eye to eye, and I miss certain friends. But the life itself? No. I was performing in that life, always trying to be the right kind of daughter, the right kind of lady. Here, I feel like I can just be myself." "And who is yourself?" "I am still figuring that out." She smiled at him across the fire. "But I like who I am becoming. Someone who can teach children and ride horses and help birth calves, apparently. I like who you are becoming too." The words were quiet but weighted with meaning. Rebecca's breath caught, and when she looked at Bennett, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse race. The fire crackled between them, and the moment stretched out, filled with all the things neither of them had said over the past months. "Bennett," she started, not sure what she was going to say. He stood abruptly. "It is getting late. We should probably turn in." The moment broke, and Rebecca felt something like disappointment wash over her. But she nodded and stood as well, and they said their good nights with careful politeness before retreating to their separate rooms. Rebecca lay in bed that night, her mind racing. She knew what was happening between them, had known for weeks if she was being honest. She was falling in love with Bennett Stone, with his quiet strength and his gentle hands, and the way he looked at her like she was something precious. The realization terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She had been in love before, or thought she had, but what she had felt for Thomas paled in comparison to this. That had been a pale, proper affection based on suitability and social expectation. This was something entirely different, something that felt like it was rooted in the very core of who she was. The question was whether Bennett felt the same way, and whether either of them was brave enough to do something about it. November arrived with frost on the windows each morning, and a cold wind that promised snow was not far behind. Rebecca's teaching schedule remained full, and she found herself genuinely loving the work. Several of her students had made remarkable progress, and their parents were effusive in their praise. She had built something real here, something that belonged entirely to her, and the pride she felt was different from anything she had known before. Mrs. Chen continued to visit 3 times a week, and her presence had become something Rebecca looked forward to. The older woman never pried, but she offered advice freely, and had taken to teaching Rebecca various skills she claimed every ranch woman should know. How to make soap, how to preserve meat for the winter, how to quilt using scraps of fabric. "You are planning to stay," Mrs. Chen observed one afternoon while they worked together on a quilt top. "Through the winter, yes," Rebecca replied carefully, "and after, I do not know yet." Mrs. Chen made a non-committal sound. "That man is in love with you. You know this, yes." Rebecca's hand stilled on the fabric. "I do not think that is true." "You do not think, or you are afraid it is true." Mrs. Chen's dark eyes were shrewd. "He looks at you like you are the sun coming up after a long night. I have known Bennett since he came to Wyoming, and I have never seen him look at anyone that way. Even if you are right, I do not know what to do about it." Rebecca's voice was barely above a whisper. "I care for him deeply, but my life is so uncertain, I do not want to hurt him." "Life is always uncertain. That is no reason to deny yourself happiness." Mrs. Chen went back to her stitching. "But you will figure it out in your own time. Just do not take too long. Good men do not wait forever." The conversation stayed with Rebecca, coloring her interactions with Bennett over the following days. She found herself watching him more carefully, looking for signs of what Mrs. Chen had claimed to see. And once she was looking, it was impossible to miss. The way his eyes followed her when he thought she was not paying attention. The careful way he never touched her unnecessarily, as if he did not trust himself to stop if he started. The small things he did to make her life easier, like ensuring there was always hot water for washing, or leaving wildflowers on the kitchen table that he must have ridden out early to gather. One evening in mid-November, the first snow began to fall. Rebecca stood at the kitchen window watching the flakes drift down in the lamplight and felt Bennett come to stand beside her. "Beautiful," she murmured. "Yes." But when she glanced at him, he was looking at her, not the snow. "Bennett." She turned to face him fully. "We need to talk." He tensed slightly. "That sounds ominous." "It is not, or maybe it is. I do not know." Rebecca took a breath, steadying herself. "These past months living here with you have been the happiest of my life. You have been more than kind, more than generous, and I do not want to do anything to jeopardize what we have built together. But I need to know, is there something more between us than friendship?" Bennett was very still, his eyes searching her face. "Do you want there to be?" "I am asking you first. All right." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "The truth is, Rebecca, you have become the center of my world. I think about you constantly. Every decision I make, I find myself wondering what you will think, how it will affect you. When you smile at me, it feels like the best thing that has happened all day. And when I lie in bed at night knowing you are across the hall, it takes everything in me not to go to you and tell you all of this." Rebecca's heart was hammering so hard she felt dizzy. "Why did you not tell me before?" "Because I did not want to pressure you." You came here trying to escape one man who wanted to control your life, and I did not want to be another person making demands of you. I wanted you to have space to figure out what you wanted without me influencing that. That is remarkably thoughtful and incredibly frustrating. Rebecca reached up and placed her hand against his chest, feeling his heart beating as fast as her own. What if what I want is you? Bennett's breath hitched. Do you want me, I mean? Yes. The word came out stronger than she expected. I did not come to Wyoming looking for love, but I found it anyway. I found you, and everything about this life we have built together feels right in a way nothing else ever has. I love you, Bennett Stone. I am in love with you, and I have been for weeks, and I am tired of pretending otherwise. For one breathless moment, Bennett just stared at her, and then he was cupping her face in his hands and kissing her with a desperation that spoke of months of restraint finally breaking. Rebecca kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his shirt, and it felt like coming home and setting out on an adventure all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Bennett rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said hoarsely. I have loved you since the day you helped birth that calf and looked at me like I had done something miraculous, maybe even before that. We have been two fools dancing around each other, Rebecca said, laughing even as tears pricked her eyes. Agreed. Bennett kissed her again, softer this time. So what do we do now? I think we stop pretending that I am just your boarder and acknowledge what this really is. Rebecca pulled back enough to look into his eyes. Unless you think this is moving too fast. After 5 months of wanting you, nothing about this feels too fast. Bennett tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with infinite gentleness. But Rebecca, I need you to be sure. Your whole life is ahead of you, and there are men out there who could offer you so much more than a ranch in Wyoming and a man who smells like horses half the time. I do not want more. I want this. I want you. She kissed him to emphasize her point. Everything that matters to me is right here. They stayed up half the night, sitting together on the sofa with Rebecca tucked against Bennett's side, talking about everything they had been too careful to discuss before. Their hopes and fears and the future they might build together. Bennett admitted he had been thinking about asking her to marry him, but had convinced himself it was too soon, that he had no right to ask. Rebecca confessed that she had been imagining what it would be like to stay at the ranch permanently, to make this her home not just for the winter but forever. I want to marry you, Bennett said, as the first gray light of dawn began to show through the windows. But I want to do it right, let you have time to be certain this is what you want. I am already certain, Rebecca insisted. Even so, let's give it through the winter. If come spring you still feel the same way, then I will ask you properly and we can make plans. Rebecca wanted to argue, but she could see the wisdom in his caution. And if she was being honest, part of her appreciated that he was not rushing her, that he was giving her the space to be absolutely sure. All right, we wait until spring. The winter that followed was harsh but beautiful in ways Rebecca had never experienced. The snow piled high around the ranch, and there were days when they could not leave the property at all. But those days became some of her favorites, when she and Bennett were snowed in together, working side by side to keep the animals fed and the house warm. They talked endlessly, about everything and nothing, and learned each other with an intimacy that went beyond the physical. They were careful to maintain propriety, especially when Mrs. Chen was around, but when they were alone, they allowed themselves the freedom to be affectionate. Stolen kisses in the barn, holding hands while watching the snow fall, sitting close enough that their thighs touched while reading by the fire. It was innocent but deeply romantic, and Rebecca treasured every moment. Christmas came, and they celebrated simply with a meal Rebecca taught herself to cook from a recipe book Mrs. Chen had loaned her. She gave Bennett a new wool scarf she had knitted in secret, and he gave her a beautiful leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. "For writing down your thoughts," he said as she ran her fingers over the smooth leather. "Or lesson plans, or whatever you want. I noticed you were always making notes on scraps of paper, and I thought you deserved something better." It was one of the most thoughtful gifts she had ever received, and she kissed him thoroughly to show her appreciation. January arrived with bitter cold and the blizzard Bennett had warned her about. For 3 days they barely left the house except to check on the animals, and Rebecca discovered what it meant to truly be isolated. But she never felt afraid, not with Bennett beside her. They kept the fire going, rationed their supplies carefully, and when the storm finally broke, they emerged to find the world transformed into something pristine and otherworldly. February brought slightly warmer temperatures and the first hints that spring would eventually arrive. Rebecca's teaching continued, though getting to town was sometimes challenging. She had built a reputation as an excellent tutor, and several families had approached her about continuing lessons through the summer months. The prospect of staying in Rock Springs permanently had gone from a vague possibility to a definite plan in her mind, though she had not yet said as much to Bennett. March arrived with mud and the first green shoots pushing up through the melting snow. The cattle began calving, and Rebecca found herself spending long hours in the barn helping Bennett assist with difficult births and making sure the newborns were nursing properly. It was exhausting work, but she loved being part of it, loved seeing new life emerge even as the last of winter's grip loosened. One evening in late March, they stood together watching the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. Bennett had his arm around Rebecca's waist and she leaned into his warmth, feeling perfectly content. "Spring is here," Bennett said quietly. "It is." Rebecca knew what he was really saying, that the deadline they had set for themselves had arrived. "Have you thought about what comes next?" "I have thought about little else." She turned in his arms to face him. "I want to stay, Bennett, not just for another season, but permanently. I want to build a life here with you, teach the children in Rock Springs, help you with the ranch, maybe have children of our own someday. I want all of it." Bennett's eyes were very bright. "Are you absolutely certain? Because once I ask you what I am about to ask, there is no taking it back." "I am certain." Her voice did not waver. He pulled a small box from his pocket and Rebecca's breath caught. Bennett opened it to reveal a simple gold band with a small emerald set in the center. "This was my mother's," he said. "The emerald is not large, but my father saved for a year to buy it for her. She left it to me when she died, and I always thought that someday I would give it to someone who would appreciate what it represented. Love and commitment and building something lasting together." He dropped to one knee right there in the mud of the ranch yard, and Rebecca's hands flew to her mouth. "Rebecca Gardner, you jumped off a train and into my life, and you have made everything better just by being in it. Will you marry me? Will you stay here and let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you as happy as you have made me?" "Yes." The word came out choked with tears. "Yes, absolutely yes." Bennett slid the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly as if it had been made for her. He stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed and cried at the same time. When he set her down, he kissed her with a passion that had been building over months of restraint, and Rebecca kissed him back with every ounce of love she felt. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the Presbyterian church where Rebecca taught. Mrs. Chen served as her attendant, and Garrett Sullivan, Bennett's former employer, stood up as best man. Most of the town came to witness the union, along with many of Rebecca's students and their families. Rebecca wore a dress of pale blue silk that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, and she carried wildflowers that Bennett had picked that morning. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Bennett kissed her with such tenderness that Rebecca felt tears slip down her cheeks. They walked back down the aisle together hand in hand, and the whole church erupted in applause and cheers. The reception was held at the ranch, and half the county seemed to turn up with food and well wishes. Rebecca was overwhelmed by the warmth of the community that had embraced her, these rough Wyoming people who had accepted an Eastern stranger without question. There was music and dancing, and Bennett proved to be a surprisingly good dancer, spinning Rebecca around the barn that had been cleared for the occasion. As the evening wore on and guests began to depart, Rebecca found herself standing with Bennett under the stars, just as they had done so many evenings before. But everything felt different now, weighted with the promise they had made to each other. "Are you happy?" Bennett asked, his arms around her waist. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be." Rebecca rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Who would have thought that abandoning a trunk at a train station would lead to this? Best decision you ever made. Bennett kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for jumping off that train. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for choosing this life. Thank you for carrying my trunk to your ranch and welcoming me home." Rebecca tilted her face up to kiss him. "I love you. I love you too, now and always." They stood there together as the stars wheeled overhead, and the ranch settled into quiet around them. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and built something beautiful from it. The years that followed were full of the kind of joy that comes from a life built on genuine partnership and love. Rebecca continued her teaching, eventually working with the town to establish a proper school that offered education to all children, regardless of their family's ability to pay. She taught there 3 days a week, and on the other days she helped Bennett run the ranch, which prospered under their joint care. Their first child, a son they named Thomas Samuel Stone after both their fathers, arrived in the spring of 1884. Rebecca went into labor in the early morning hours, and Bennett delivered his son with the same steady competence he brought to everything else. When he placed the squalling infant in Rebecca's arms, there were tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," Bennett whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "He is ours," Rebecca replied, and that felt like the most perfect thing of all. 2 years later, their daughter Elizabeth Mee joined the family, dark-haired and fierce from the moment she entered the world. Bennett doted on both his children with a tenderness that made Rebecca fall in love with him all over again. He was a patient father, teaching Thomas to ride almost as soon as the boy could walk, and never discouraging Elizabeth when she insisted on following her brother everywhere, and doing everything he did. The ranch expanded slowly but steadily. Bennett hired 2 permanent ranch hands, young men who reminded him of himself at their age, and he treated them fairly and paid them well. Rebecca's school flourished, and she took particular pride in the number of her students who went on to further education, including 3 who earned scholarships to universities back east. Mrs. Chen remained a constant presence in their lives, a surrogate grandmother to their children and a source of wisdom for both Bennett and Rebecca. She had been right about everything, Rebecca reflected sometimes. About Bennett's feelings, about not waiting too long, about life being uncertain, but that being no reason to deny yourself happiness. On a warm evening in June of 1891, Rebecca and Bennett sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Thomas was 9 now, tall for his age and already showing signs of the man he would become. Elizabeth was 7, all wild curls and fearless energy. A third child, another son named James, slept in Rebecca's arms, just 3 months old and perfect in every way. "Do you ever think about that day at the train station?" Bennett asked, his hand finding Rebecca's. "Sometimes." Rebecca smiled at the memory. "I think about how terrified I was and how certain I was that I had made a terrible mistake. And then I think about everything that came after, and I cannot imagine my life having gone any other way. I saw you standing there looking lost, and something in me just knew I had to help you. I did not know why at the time, but looking back, I think some part of me recognized you." Bennett squeezed her hand. "Recognized that you were going to change everything." "We changed everything together," Rebecca corrected. "You gave me a place to land when I needed it most, but I like to think I gave you something too." "You gave me everything," Bennett said simply. "A family, a partner, a life richer than anything I imagined I could have. This ranch was just land and work before you came. You turned it into a home." Rebecca leaned her head against his shoulder, careful not to jostle the sleeping baby. "I am glad I jumped off that train. I am glad I picked up your trunk." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped lower, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of orange and gold. The mountains rose in the distance, ancient and unchanging, and Rebecca thought about how much her life had transformed since that August day in 1882, when she had made the impulsive, terrifying decision to step off a train and into an unknown future. She had thought she was running away, but what she had really been doing was running toward something, toward the life she was meant to live. Toward Bennett, toward this ranch, toward the person she was always supposed to become. Thomas called out to his father, asking him to come see something he had found, and Bennett stood with a smile. He pressed a kiss to Rebecca's forehead, ruffled Elizabeth's hair as she ran past, and headed toward his son. Rebecca watched them together, this family they had built, and felt a swell of gratitude so profound it took her breath away. The evening settled around them, warm and perfect, and Rebecca knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. She had found her home, not in a place but in the life she and Bennett had created together, in the love that had grown from a simple act of kindness into something enduring and true. Years continued to pass in their steady, satisfying rhythm. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and Rebecca and Bennett aged together with grace and deepening affection. They faced hardships, as all couples do, drought years when the cattle suffered and Rebecca had to be creative in stretching their resources, winters that seemed endless, and the inevitable losses that come with life. But they faced everything together, and that partnership made even the difficult times bearable. When Thomas turned 18, he announced his intention to study veterinary medicine at Colorado Agricultural College. Bennett was so proud he could barely speak, and Rebecca cried happy tears as they saw their eldest son off on the train, his eyes bright with excitement and possibility. Elizabeth followed her brother's example of ambition, if not his specific path, and at 16, she shocked everyone by declaring she wanted to study law. Rebecca championed her daughter's dreams fiercely, finding a school that would accept female students and helping Elizabeth prepare for the rigorous entrance examinations. James, their youngest, turned out to have his father's love of the land and announced at age 12 that he wanted to run the ranch someday. Bennett began teaching him everything he knew, and Rebecca watched with joy as father and son worked side by side, building on the legacy Bennett had created. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Bennett took Rebecca on a trip to San Francisco, the city she had been heading toward that day she jumped off the train. They stayed in a fine hotel, ate at elegant restaurants, and went to the theater. It was exciting and glamorous, and after a week, Rebecca was ready to go home. "I chose right," she told Bennett on the train ride back to Wyoming. "I do not regret a single thing. Even though I cannot give you all this. Bennett gestured vaguely at the luxury of the passenger car. Especially because you cannot give me all this. Rebecca took his hand. I do not want luxury, Bennett. I never did. I wanted a life that meant something, work that mattered, and someone to love who loved me in return. You gave me all of that and more. They returned to the ranch to find it running smoothly under the care of their hired men and James, who at 15 was already proving to be a capable manager. The house felt welcoming, and Rebecca realized with a deep contentment that she was genuinely happy to be home. More years passed. Thomas returned from college as Dr. Thomas Stone and set up a veterinary practice in Rock Springs, where he met and married a spirited young woman named Clara. Elizabeth became an attorney, one of the first female lawyers in Wyoming, and she fought tirelessly for women's rights and legal reforms. She married a fellow lawyer named Richard, and together they built a practice that became renowned throughout the territory. James took over more and more of the ranch's operations, and when he married a rancher's daughter named Sarah, they built a house on the eastern part of the property and began raising their own family. Rebecca continued teaching until she was 65, at which point she handed over the school she had built to a younger teacher, but still volunteered several times a week. She loved watching new generations of children learn and grow, and several of her former students had gone on to become teachers themselves, carrying forward her passion for education. Bennett aged gracefully, his dark hair turning silver, his face gaining more lines but losing none of its essential kindness. He still worked the ranch every day, though he left more of the heavy labor to James and their hands. On warm evenings, he and Rebecca would still sit on the porch together, watching the sun set over the mountains, and the contentment between them was a palpable thing. On a spring evening in 1922, exactly 40 years after Rebecca had jumped off that train, they celebrated with their entire family gathered at the ranch. 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild on the way filled the house with noise and love. Rebecca looked around at all of them, these people who existed because she had made one impulsive, terrifying decision, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Bennett found her standing alone in the kitchen for a moment, taking a breath amid the chaos, and he wrapped his arms around her from behind. She leaned back against him, still fitting perfectly after all these years. "Happy anniversary, my love," he murmured against her hair. "Happy anniversary." Rebecca turned in his arms to face him. 40 years. Can you believe it? Best 40 years of my life." Bennett kissed her softly. "I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts, they made the good parts that much sweeter." They rejoined their family, and the celebration continued late into the night. Rebecca watched her children interact with their own children, saw the way Thomas held his infant grandson with the same tenderness Bennett had shown with their babies, noticed how Elizabeth's daughters had inherited their mother's fierce independence. The legacy they had built together was not just the ranch or the school, but this family, these people who carried forward the values of hard work, education, kindness, and love. Later, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Rebecca and Bennett stood once again on their porch under the stars. The night was clear and cool, and the sounds of the ranch settling around them were as familiar as breathing. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had gotten on that train?" Bennett asked. "Not really," Rebecca admitted. "I cannot imagine any version of my life that does not include you. It feels like everything that happened before that day was just leading me to that moment when I would be brave enough to jump. And I happened to be there to catch you." "You happened to be there to carry my trunk and welcome me home," Rebecca corrected with a smile. "Best thing anyone ever said to me. I meant it then, and I mean it now. You are home, Rebecca. Always have been, always will be. They stood together in the darkness, these two people who had built a life from a moment of chance and choice. And Rebecca felt the deep satisfaction of a story well told, a life well lived. She had taken a leap of faith 40 years ago, and it had led her to everything she had ever wanted, but had not known how to name. The years that followed continued to be full and rich. Bennett and Rebecca aged into their 70s, and then their 80s, still sharp-minded and engaged with the world around them. They witnessed incredible changes, from the advent of automobiles to the expansion of women's suffrage to the way the Wild West they had known slowly transformed into something more civilized and connected. Through it all, their love remained constant. It deepened with time, becoming less about passion and more about the profound comfort of being known completely by another person. They could communicate with a glance, finish each other's sentences, and their silences together were as meaningful as their conversations. When Bennett turned 85, he began to slow down significantly. The years of hard physical labor had taken their toll on his body, though his mind remained as clear as ever. Rebecca, 2 years younger and still remarkably vital, nursed him through increasing frailty with the same devotion he had always shown her. One evening in late autumn, with the first snow of the season beginning to fall, Bennett called all their children to the ranch. He was in bed now most of the time, and Rebecca sat beside him holding his hand, while Thomas, Elizabeth, and James gathered close. "I want you all to know," Bennett said, his voice weaker than it had once been but still firm with conviction, "that this life, this family, everything we built together has been more than I ever dreamed of. Your mother took a chance on a rough cowboy, and she made me better than I had any right to be." "Papa, do not talk like that," Elizabeth protested, tears in her eyes. "Let me finish." Bennett squeezed Rebecca's hand. "I am not afraid of what comes next. I have lived a full life, loved deeply, and watched my children and grandchildren thrive. That is all any man could ask for, but I need you three to promise me something. Take care of your mother. She is the strongest person I have ever known, but she will need you." They promised through their tears, and then they left Bennett and Rebecca alone together. She climbed into bed beside him, something she had done every night for more than 50 years, and he wrapped his arm around her. "I am not ready to let you go," Rebecca whispered against his chest. "I know, my love, but we knew this day would come eventually." Bennett kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for every single day. Thank you for jumping off that train. Thank you for carrying my trunk home." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and when morning came, Rebecca woke to find that Bennett had passed peacefully in the night, still holding her close. The grief was profound, a physical thing that made breathing difficult and the world seem colorless. Rebecca had known this loss would come eventually, had tried to prepare herself for it, but nothing could really prepare you for losing the person who had been your partner for more than half a century. Her children gathered around her, and in the days following Bennett's funeral, Rebecca found comfort in their presence and in the grandchildren who brought life and noise back into the too-quiet house. She stayed at the ranch, unable to imagine living anywhere else, and slowly the sharp edges of her grief softened into something she could carry. She lived for another 7 years after Bennett's passing, remaining active and engaged despite her age. She continued to volunteer at the school, doted on her growing number of great-grandchildren, and spent long hours sitting on the porch remembering. The ranch stayed in the family, with James running it capably and his children learning the trade. On a warm summer evening in 1934, 3 days after her 94th birthday, Rebecca Gardner Stone passed away peacefully in her sleep in the same bedroom where she had spent her wedding night, where she had birthed her children, where Bennett had died in her arms. Her family buried her beside him under the cottonwood tree on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. The legacy they left behind was enormous. Their children and grandchildren continued to thrive, carrying forward the values of education, hard work, kindness, and love that had defined Bennett and Rebecca's life together. The school Rebecca had founded remained a cornerstone of Rock Springs, and several buildings on the property bore plaques commemorating her contributions to education in Wyoming. The ranch prospered through multiple generations, a testament to Bennett's vision and skill. But perhaps their greatest legacy was the story itself, told and retold in the family until it became legend. How Rebecca had jumped off a train in a moment of desperate courage. How Bennett had seen a woman in need and offered help without expectation of return. How a trunk carried to a ranch and two simple words, "Welcome home," had sparked a love story that lasted more than 50 years and produced a family that would span generations. It was a story about taking chances, about the way one moment of choice can alter the entire trajectory of a life. About finding home not in a place but in a person, and building something lasting through commitment, work, and enduring love. It was a story that captured everything beautiful and hard about life in the American West during a time of tremendous change, and it resonated because at its core, it was a story about what it means to truly choose your own life and then live it with courage and grace. And so the story of Rebecca and Bennett Stone became part of the fabric of Rock Springs, Wyoming. A reminder that sometimes the most important journey begins not by getting on a train, but by finding the courage to jump off one. That real love is not about grand gestures, but about showing up every day and choosing each other again and again. That a life well lived is measured not in wealth or status, but in the love shared, the work done with pride, the family raised with care, and the legacy of kindness left behind. Their great-great-grandchildren still work the ranch today, and every spring when the wildflowers bloom on the hill where Rebecca and Bennett are buried, someone from the family makes the trip to lay fresh flowers and remember the couple who started it all. And the trunk that Bennett carried that first day still exists, carefully preserved in the ranch house, a tangible reminder of where it all began. Inside it are Rebecca's teaching certificates, her journals, photographs of the family through the years, and a worn copy of a poetry book Bennett gave her for their 5th anniversary. It sits in the main room of the ranch house as a reminder to everyone who sees it that sometimes the most extraordinary lives come from the simplest beginnings, and that love, real love, can transform everything when we are brave enough to reach for it.